The struggle and the courtroom. Helena Martinez stood in the middle of the courthouse, clutching her hands nervously. Her heart raced in her chest, and every inch of her body screamed for her to run, to escape the situation that had brought her here today. But she couldn't run. She had no choice but to face it head-on. Beside her, her 7-year-old son, Diego, stood quietly. He was dressed in a neatly pressed shirt, his small fingers wrapped around a worn-out teddy bear, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Diego had been her rock, even at such a tender age. He always sensed when things weren't right, when the weight of life's struggles was pressing on her. But today, he seemed unaware of just how heavy the burden on her shoulders had become. The courtroom felt cold, oppressive, and vast. Its high ceilings loomed above her, and the dark wood paneling gave the room a somber, imposing air. It was a space meant for decisions that could change lives, but Elena felt as though it were suffocating her. She had been here before, but never for something like this. The judge, who had been sitting at the bench, surveyed the room with a stern look. Judge Rodriguez had a reputation for being an iron fist in a velvet glove. He was known for his unyielding commitment to the law, for his belief that justice should be impartial and strict. There were whispers in the hallways about how unforgiving he could be, especially when it came to people who couldn't seem to keep up with their responsibilities. Elena had heard the stories, the rumors, the warnings, but she had no choice but to trust that he would hear her out. Elena's mind was spinning as she stepped forward, her voice wavering as she began to explain her situation. She had worked tirelessly for years to provide for Diego, juggling 2 jobs to make ends meet. She had been a home health aide by day and a hotel cleaning staff by night, but life had thrown its punches, and this time, she couldn't keep up. A few weeks ago, Diego had fallen ill with a high fever that kept him home from school for several days. Elena had missed work to care for him, and when she was finally able to return, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing on her. Bills stacked up, missed hours piled on top of each other, and now a $250 utility bill was threatening to destroy everything. She couldn't afford it. She didn't know how she was going to pay it. As she spoke, Elena could feel Judge Rodriguez's cold gaze on her. His face remained expressionless, his posture rigid. He didn't seem to care about the story she was telling. He didn't look like a man who was moved by hardship. Elena had hoped for understanding, but it was slowly becoming clear that hope might not be enough. She glanced at Diego. He had been so quiet, so calm. His small face was full of curiosity, but his eyes seemed to carry an awareness far beyond his years. Elena swallowed hard, trying to push back the lump in her throat. She was on the verge of breaking, of collapsing under the weight of it all. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, something unexpected happened. Diego tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice small but clear in the silent room. Elena froze. Everyone turned their eyes to him, and the tension in the room seemed to heighten. It was as if time had stopped. "Excuse me, sir," Diego said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "My mommy works very hard." The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, but they struck a chord in the courtroom. Elena's heart skipped a beat, and she looked down at her son, who was now standing tall beside her. She wanted to hush him, to stop him from speaking, but Diego wasn't finished. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the interruption. He had expected to hear from the woman who stood before him, but not from her young son. His expression softened just a bit, a fleeting shift that Elena barely noticed in her state of panic. "What do you know about your mother working hard?" Judge Rodriguez asked, his voice losing a fraction of its usual hardness. Diego didn't hesitate. "Every day, Mommy wakes up before the sun," he began, his voice full of earnestness. "She makes me breakfast, helps me get dressed, and then she goes to work. She works all day long. Sometimes she comes home so tired that she can barely walk. But she still asks me how my day was and helps me with my homework." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized just how much Diego understood, how deeply he saw the sacrifices she made for him. She had tried to shield him from the weight of their struggles, to keep him in a world of innocence and hope. But in that moment, it was clear that Diego had seen it all. The exhaustion, the tears, the constant struggle to make ends meet. The courtroom was dead silent. Not even a whisper. It was as though everyone was waiting for the next words to come. Elena could feel the gaze of the judge on her son, and she could see the faint shift in his expression. The hard lines of his face, which had been unmoving just moments ago, seemed to soften. For the first time, Elena saw a glimmer of something in the judge's eyes, something that resembled compassion. Diego continued, his words coming out faster now. "Sometimes, Mommy cries when she thinks I'm asleep, but she always makes sure I'm okay first. She counts every penny, and she even sold her grandmother's gold bracelet to buy my school supplies." Elena's eyes welled with tears. She had never intended for Diego to see the sacrifices she made for him. But here he was, telling the truth of their lives to a room full of strangers, his voice filled with the kind of honesty that only a child could possess. And in that moment, something shifted in the judge's demeanor. The cold, calculating magistrate that had first greeted them now seemed distant, replaced by a man who was no longer just judging a case. He was listening, really listening. The room remained still, every eye locked on the boy who had just spoken the truth of his family's struggle. Elena held her breath, not knowing what to expect next. The world seemed to hold its breath along with her, as though everyone was waiting for the moment when the judge would speak. Finally, Judge Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Elena's hands trembled as she waited for his words. Would he show mercy? Would he offer the kindness she so desperately needed? "Miss Martinez," the judge said, his voice lower now, gentler, "I want you to step closer to the bench." Elena's heart pounded as she took a step forward, her knees shaking. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew that in that moment, something profound was beginning to unfold, something that might just change everything. A new path and unexpected support. The courtroom was a quiet shell after Judge Rodriguez's announcement, the hum of murmurs slowly rising as people digested the unexpected turn of events. Elena's heart still hammered in her chest as she looked down at the stack of papers the judge had handed her. The documents felt like more than just information. They were possibilities, real opportunities that could pull them from the brink of collapse. For a moment, she didn't move. The world outside the courtroom continued on, oblivious to the small miracle that had just unfolded. But in that space, surrounded by the cold wood of the courtroom and the watchful eyes of a few spectators, Elena felt something stirring deep within her, a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Elena glanced at Diego, his innocent face still lit with a faint smile, his small hand gripping hers tightly. His eyes held none of the fear that had plagued her over the past few weeks. Instead, his confidence seemed to shine brighter in that moment, as if he had always believed that good things were possible. She had kept her fears from him for so long, but Diego had a way of seeing through everything. He had seen her struggles and sacrifices, but still, he trusted that things would get better. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" Diego asked quietly, his voice tinged with innocence, but there was a depth in his question that struck Elena to her core. Elena bent down, cupping his small face with both hands, her thumb gently brushing against his cheek. "Yes, Diego," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be more than okay. Things are going to get better, I promise." And for the first time in a long time, Elena truly believed it. She had always told Diego that everything would be fine, but the weight of their reality had made it hard to fully believe those words. But now, with the judge's unexpected kindness, a new door had opened for them. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. There was a chance for something better, something brighter. The judge cleared his throat, snapping Elena back to reality. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I want you to take these documents seriously. These programs are more than just an opportunity. They're a chance for you to take control of your future. You're already working hard, but I believe you have the potential to do more. The system isn't always kind to people in your situation, but I want to offer you a chance to break out of that cycle." Elena nodded, trying to compose herself. "Thank you," she said softly, her words barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say. This means everything to me. To us." The judge gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just make the most of it," he replied. "There's no shame in asking for help, and there's no shame in trying to improve your life. You deserve a chance to succeed, Miss Martinez. Don't waste it." With that, the judge leaned back in his chair, signaling that their time in the courtroom was coming to an end. Elena felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, mixed with disbelief. This was a turning point, a moment that had the power to change everything. She glanced at Diego once more, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, she knew that she would do whatever it took to make sure he never had to worry about where their next meal would come from, or whether they could keep the lights on. As Elena and Diego walked out of the courtroom, the weight that had been bearing down on her for so long seemed to lift just a little. The bright sunlight outside felt like a metaphorical ray of hope, as if the universe had finally decided to offer them a reprieve. Diego skipped ahead of her, his small feet bouncing as he hummed a little tune. Elena watched him with a mixture of pride and relief. How could he be so carefree, so innocent, when their lives had been in such turmoil? It amazed her every day how children could still find joy in the smallest things, in the simplest moments. She could only hope that as he grew, Diego would hold onto that resilience, that unwavering faith in the good, even when life threw its hardest punches. They walked to the small park near the courthouse, a place where they often stopped after doctor's appointments or long days at the grocery store. The park was quiet now, with only a few children playing in the distance. Elena sat down on one of the benches, her mind racing with the possibilities that the judge's resources had opened up. She pulled the stack of documents from her bag and began to scan them. Each one felt like a key to a different future. Healthcare management courses, job training for administrative positions, scholarships for single mothers. For the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It felt like a puzzle that was finally coming together. Diego sat next to her, his legs swinging back and forth as he peered at the papers. "What's that, Mommy?" he asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Elena smiled softly and handed him one of the brochures. "This is for a class that could help me get a better job," she explained. "It's something I've been thinking about for a while, but now we have a real chance to make it happen." Diego studied the brochure, his small brow furrowing in concentration. "Is it going to take a long time?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Elena chuckled softly, her hand brushing his hair away from his face. "It might take a while, but we'll make it through, Diego. We always do." As she sat there, flipping through the pages, Elena couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that. But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. The idea of going back to school, of learning new skills, felt like something she could actually achieve. The burden of survival wasn't hanging over her head anymore. There was a way out, a path toward a future where she didn't have to worry every single day about how to make ends meet. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and applications. Elena was exhausted, her days packed with her 2 jobs and the new responsibilities that came with her plans for further education. But there was something different this time. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was building something for the future, and that sense of purpose made all the late nights and early mornings feel worthwhile. On the days when Elena felt like giving up, when the weight of exhaustion threatened to drown her, she would think of Diego's face in that courtroom, how he had stood tall, his tiny voice filled with unwavering faith. She would remember the judge's kindness, the way his gaze softened as he saw not just a case number, but a woman who was doing everything she could for her son. It was as though that one moment had given her permission to dream again, to believe that she could reach for something greater than just getting by. In the weeks that followed, Alina enrolled in the night classes offered by the community college. It wasn't easy. She was tired, and there were days when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But she pushed through. Every time she walked into that classroom, she felt like she was taking another step forward. Not just for herself, but for Diego. She wanted him to know that no matter how hard things got, she would never give up. She would always keep moving forward. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Alina collapsed onto the couch after tucking Diego into bed. She hadn't had time to stop and breathe, let alone think about how far she had come. But as she sat there, staring at the stack of textbooks on the coffee table, Alina realized something. She had already come a long way, and with every passing day, she was getting closer to the life she had always dreamed of. In the quiet stillness of that moment, Alina smiled. She had been given a chance, a second chance, and she was going to make the most of it. For herself, for Diego, and for the future they would build together. The challenge of change. The weeks following the court hearing felt like a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Alina. What had begun as a single, unexpected moment of mercy had quickly transformed into a series of choices and challenges. The new opportunities in front of her felt like a light at the end of a tunnel, but the path toward that light was anything but easy. Alina had always been a fighter. From the moment she had become a mother, she had known that her life would be filled with challenges. But nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of trying to balance work, motherhood, and the demands of education. Each day felt like a careful balancing act, one where every decision, no matter how small, seemed to have far-reaching consequences. It wasn't just the long hours or the exhaustion. The real challenge was the nagging feeling that she had to be everything to everyone. At work, she had to be efficient, patient, and compassionate, giving her best to the elderly patients she cared for. At home, she was a mother, trying to shield Diego from the weight of their circumstances, while also being honest about the sacrifices she had to make. And now, with her night classes, she was also a student, someone who had to learn to navigate an entirely new world, one that felt just out of reach. Alina's schedule was grueling. She would wake up at 5:30 a.m., prepare a quick breakfast for Diego, and get him ready for school. Then she would dash to her first job, caring for elderly patients who needed constant attention. Her shifts often stretched to 10 hours or more, leaving her little time to rest. Afterward, she would head to the hotel where she worked as a cleaning staff member until late at night. By the time she returned home, it would be past midnight. She would help Diego with his homework if he was still awake, and then collapse into bed herself, exhausted and drained. The nights she spent in class were some of the toughest. She had enrolled in healthcare management courses, hoping to gain skills that would open doors to a more stable, higher-paying job. But the exhaustion from her long shifts left her struggling to concentrate. She'd sit in class, surrounded by younger students, many of whom seemed to have an easier time grasping the material. Alina often felt like an outsider, like she was trying to catch up to something that had passed her by years ago. But the thought of failing, of giving up on the chance that Judge Rodriguez had given her, kept her going. One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift, Alina sat in her car for a few moments before heading inside. Her mind was racing. She had a test the next day, a crucial one that could impact her grade, but she hadn't even had the time to study. She thought back to the moments in the courtroom when Diego had spoken so honestly about her struggles, and she felt a pang of guilt. She had promised him everything would be okay, that they would be fine, but now she was struggling to keep that promise. Would she ever be able to give him the life she had dreamed of? Was it possible to build a future when everything seemed to be so out of reach? The door to the apartment creaked open, and Diego, as always, was waiting for her. He was perched on the couch with a comic book in his hands, his small feet dangling off the edge. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with a smile. "Monty, you're home," he cheered, his voice filled with genuine joy. Alina managed a tired smile and sank down beside him. "I'm here, Mio," she said softly, brushing her fingers through his hair. "How was your day?" Diego launched into a recounting of his day at school, describing his favorite parts with excitement. Elena listened intently, letting his innocent words wash over her. She needed this connection, this reminder that in the midst of all the stress and exhaustion, there was still a bright light in her life. She couldn't afford to lose sight of that. But as Diego continued to chatter away, Elena's mind kept returning to the test. She hadn't prepared at all, and she knew that if she didn't pull herself together soon, she could fall behind. The fear of failure weighed heavily on her chest, and the thought of letting Diego down, of not being able to provide for him the way she wanted to, gnawed at her. That night, after putting Diego to bed, Elena sat at the kitchen table, staring at her textbooks. Her eyes were blurry from exhaustion, and the words on the pages seemed to swim before her. How could she do this? How could she possibly manage everything and still succeed? It was then that the weight of her situation hit her all at once. She was overwhelmed by her jobs, her studies, and her responsibilities as a mother. The self-doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe it was all too much, too big of a dream to chase. She let out a shaky breath and wiped her eyes. The tears that had been threatening to spill for days finally found their way out. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to cry, to feel the weight of her struggle, to grieve the life she had hoped for. But as quickly as the tears came, they stopped. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not when she had come this far. Not when Diego was depending on her. Elena took a deep breath and opened her textbook again. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't. The next day, she woke up even earlier, determined to find a way to study between her jobs. She packed her books into her bag, praying that there would be even a small window of time she could use to catch up. During her break at the hotel, she found a quiet corner in the break room and pulled out her notes, trying to make sense of the material. She struggled to focus. Her mind was tired, and the exhaustion made it difficult to concentrate. But she kept pushing forward. Every word she read, every concept she reviewed, felt like a small victory. It wasn't easy, but Elena knew that this was what she had to do. She couldn't afford to take shortcuts or give up. The future she dreamed of wasn't going to be handed to her. It was something she would have to fight for every single day. And she was ready to fight. By the time the night classes rolled around, Elena was mentally drained, but she had prepared as best as she could. She had no choice but to keep moving forward, even when every fiber of her being begged for rest. But when the class started, something unexpected happened. As the instructor went over the material, Elena realized that she wasn't as lost as she had felt before. It wasn't easy, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. She had been working so hard to balance everything that she hadn't given herself credit for how far she had come. When the test finally arrived, Elena felt a sense of calm wash over her, even though she knew she hadn't studied as much as she would have liked. She gave it her all. Every bit of knowledge she had managed to gather, every hour she had sacrificed, poured into that exam. And when it was over, she knew she had done her best. The days that followed were filled with small victories. She managed to keep up with her studies despite the overwhelming demands of her two jobs, and she could see the progress she was making. She wasn't where she wanted to be yet, but she was moving in the right direction. Every assignment she completed, every lecture she attended, every moment she spent studying for her exams, brought her closer to the future she dreamed of for herself and Diego. But the biggest victory of all came one evening when Diego, his eyes sparkling with excitement, ran up to her as she walked through the door. "Mommy, I did it," he exclaimed. "I got an A on my math test." Elena's heart swelled with pride. She knelt down to his level, her exhaustion forgotten in that moment. "I'm so proud of you, Diego," she said, hugging him tightly. "You're amazing." Diego grinned and hugged her back. "I learned from the best," he said, his voice full of confidence. Elena smiled through her tears, her heart full. In that moment, she realized that the path they were on wasn't just about her struggles or her sacrifices. It was about the strength they had built together, about the bond they shared, and the unwavering belief that no matter how hard things got, they could overcome anything. With Diego by her side, Alina knew that there was no challenge they couldn't face. The road to redemption. The months seemed to pass in a blur, each one blending into the next as Alina fought to balance the relentless demands of her jobs, the challenging coursework, and her role as a mother. But despite the exhaustion and moments of self-doubt, there was a quiet strength growing within her. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving to herself and to Diego that they could overcome anything, that they could build a life beyond struggle, beyond hardship. Alina's routine had become almost robotic. She didn't have the luxury of time to sit and reflect. Every moment of her day was planned down to the minute. Wake up, get Diego ready for school, go to work, then squeeze in her studies wherever she could. In the rare moments of quiet, when Diego was asleep and the house was still, Alina would pull out her textbooks and try to study. But the exhaustion never let her fully focus. She had become accustomed to the physical fatigue, the aching in her muscles, and the constant pressure in her mind. But the weight of it all was no longer as oppressive. There was a sense of purpose now, a sense of direction that had been absent for so long. In the evenings, after Diego went to bed, Alina would often find herself lost in thought, thinking about the life she had dreamed of before the weight of reality had crushed her ambitions. She had always wanted more for herself. She had wanted to make a difference, not just for Diego, but for herself as well. She wanted to prove that no matter where she started in life, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, she could make it. But sometimes, when the fatigue was overwhelming and the bills were piling up, it felt like the dream was just that, a dream. She wasn't sure how she could keep going, but every time she thought about quitting, she remembered Judge Rodriguez's words, "You deserve a chance to succeed." That sentence echoed in her mind, driving her forward even when her body screamed for rest. One evening, as Alina sat at the kitchen table, reviewing her notes for an upcoming exam, she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood up, a little surprised, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face, Mrs. Campbell, one of the elderly patients Alina had cared for in the past. Mrs. Campbell had been one of Alina's first clients when she started her job as a home health aide. She had a warm, kind smile and a sharp wit that kept Alina on her toes. Alina opened the door, surprised to see her standing there, looking slightly disoriented but still very much herself. "Mrs. Campbell," Alina said, her voice soft. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Campbell smiled warmly. "Well, honey, I just wanted to check on you," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "You've been working so hard. I wanted to see how you were doing. You never come by anymore." Alina felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't had time to visit Mrs. Campbell lately. The woman had become more than just a patient to her. She had become a kind of surrogate grandmother, offering wisdom, comfort, and even a bit of laughter on the toughest days. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Campbell," Alina said, stepping aside to let her in. "I've just been so busy. You know how it is." The older woman nodded knowingly, her eyes softening. "I know, dear. I can see it in your face. You've been running yourself ragged. But you don't have to do this alone, you know." Alina felt a lump form in her throat. She had always kept her struggles to herself, pushing through each day alone. But Mrs. Campbell was right. She didn't have to do it alone. She had people who cared for her, people who wanted to help. That realization hit Alina with a force that left her momentarily speechless. "I'm proud of you, Alina," Mrs. Campbell continued, her voice steady. "You've come so far. You're doing more than just surviving. You're thriving. But don't forget that you're human. It's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to take a moment to breathe." The words were simple, but they struck Alina deeply. She had been so focused on pushing forward, on proving that she could do it all on her own, that she hadn't stopped to appreciate the support around her. She had been so caught up in the idea of struggling through it alone that she hadn't realized there were people in her life willing to offer their help. Alina smiled gratefully at Mrs. Campbell. "Thank you," she said softly. "I needed to hear that." The older woman patted her hand gently. "You're welcome, dear. Just remember, you've got a whole village behind you. And sometimes it's okay to lean on them." That night, as Alina sat at the kitchen table, reflecting on Mrs. Campbell's visit, she felt a shift in herself. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about embracing the support that had always been available to her, whether she had recognized it or not. There were people who cared for her, who wanted to see her succeed, and for the first time in a long time, Alina allowed herself to lean on them. The next morning, she woke up with a new sense of resolve. She would still work hard. She would still push herself to achieve her dreams, but she would no longer carry the weight alone. She had to allow herself the grace to ask for help when she needed it, to accept the kindness of others without guilt or hesitation. As the weeks passed, Alina's life began to take on a new rhythm. She was still juggling her jobs, but now she found small moments of peace, times when she could take a step back, breathe, and appreciate how far she had come. She still had a long way to go, but she no longer felt like she was treading water. She was swimming toward something greater, toward a future where she could give Diego the life he deserved. Her schoolwork began to improve as well. She found herself absorbing the material more easily, her confidence growing with each passing day. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that progress fueled her determination. Every time she struggled with a concept, she reminded herself that she was doing this for Diego. Every hour of study, every sacrifice, every challenge, it was all worth it because it meant creating a better future for her son. One afternoon, as Alina sat in class, reviewing her notes for the upcoming final, she received a message on her phone. It was from Mrs. Campbell. "I've been thinking about you, dear. I know you're working hard, but don't forget to take a break and enjoy life once in a while. You've earned it. We'll be here when you're ready to rest." Alina smiled at the message. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people in her life who were helping her navigate this journey. She wasn't alone. And she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, step by step, with the love and support of those around her. As she walked out of the classroom that day, a wave of relief washed over her. The end of the semester was approaching, and though she still had a long road ahead, Alina knew that she was on the right path. She had found her strength, and more importantly, she had found the courage to ask for help when she needed it. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was within her reach, and with Diego by her side, Alina knew they could face whatever came next, together. The turning point. The months had passed since Alina first set foot in the courtroom, since that pivotal moment when Judge Rodriguez offered her a second chance. Now, as she approached the halfway point in her healthcare management program, Alina could feel the weight of her journey behind her. It had been a long and exhausting road, full of sacrifices, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt. But with every passing day, the life she had dreamed of was becoming a little more tangible. Her work-life balance had finally found some stability. Alina had managed to scale back her cleaning hours at the hotel, thanks to her boss, who had noticed her commitment and offered her some more flexible shifts. This allowed her to spend more time at home with Diego, and for the first time in a long time, gave her a small pocket of space to breathe. But there was still no room for complacency. Alina knew she couldn't let her guard down. Not now, not when they were so close to a new beginning. Each day brought its own set of challenges. On some days, she would get home from work, exhausted beyond belief, and find herself struggling to stay awake while studying for her exams. On others, Diego would sense her fatigue and insist on helping her with her homework, even though his small hands could barely hold the pencil properly. It made Alina smile every time. Her son, so eager to help, even when he should have been focusing on his own schoolwork. His unwavering faith in her abilities kept her going, even on the hardest days. But despite the support from her coworkers and the community around her, Elena often felt the burden of being the single mother. She had been doing this alone for so long, and while she had accepted that her responsibilities were hers to bear, there were moments when the weight became too much. As she studied late into the night, with the glow of the desk lamp illuminating the room, she couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. Could she really make this work? Could she really create the life she dreamed of for Diego? One morning, as she rushed through her usual morning routine, getting Diego ready for school, preparing breakfast, and grabbing her things for work, Elena felt the familiar sense of panic rising in her chest. It was a Friday, and she had a big exam that afternoon. The last thing she needed was an unexpected obstacle. But of course, life had other plans. As Elena was about to leave the house, she noticed the mail piled up by the door. She hadn't had the chance to sort through it in a few days. She picked up the stack, flipping through the envelopes. Most of them were bills, but one envelope caught her eye. It was from the landlord. A sense of dread washed over her as she tore open the letter, her eyes scanning the contents. Her stomach dropped as she read the first line. Final notice of eviction. Elena stood frozen, the words blurring before her eyes. The eviction notice was the result of missed rent payments, payments that had become impossible to make while she juggled 2 jobs and tried to keep up with the demands of her education. She had been late several times in the past few months, but she had always managed to make the payment in full, often scraping together every last penny. But this time, she couldn't pay it. And now, the looming threat of eviction felt like a cruel reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she was always one step away from falling apart. Her breath quickened, and she felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She hadn't told Diego about the financial struggles they were facing. He didn't know how close they had come to losing everything. But as Elena stood there, staring at the letter, she felt a crushing sense of guilt. How could she keep promising Diego that everything would be okay when the world seemed to be crumbling around them? She needed to act fast. She couldn't lose the apartment, not now, not after everything they had been through. Elena quickly grabbed her phone and called the landlord's office, hoping to work out a solution. But when she was put on hold for what felt like an eternity, the pressure in her chest only intensified. Her mind raced as she mentally calculated every penny she had left in her account. There was no way she could afford another eviction fee on top of her other bills. Just as she was about to hang up in frustration, a voice came through the phone. "Hello, this is Carol from the landlord's office. How may I help you?" Elena's voice cracked as she spoke. "I received the eviction notice. I'm trying to figure out a way to pay the rent, but I can't. I don't know what to do. Please, I don't want to lose our home." Carol's voice softened. "I understand, Miss Martinez. I know you've been late a few times, but I see that you've always paid eventually. Is there any way you can make a partial payment? We might be able to work something out, but you'll need to get back to us quickly." Elena felt a flicker of hope, small, but it was enough to keep her from collapsing. "I'll do everything I can," she said. "I'll make a partial payment today. I just need a little more time. I'll come up with the rest as soon as I can." As soon as she hung up, Elena's hands shook as she stared at her phone. She had bought herself some time, but how much time exactly? And how was she going to come up with the money? The pressure felt unbearable. But in that moment, something shifted. Elena took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from her brow, and made a decision. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. She had come too far. She had worked too hard. And she wasn't about to let this one setback derail everything. After a few moments of contemplation, Elena made a call to a financial assistance program that had been mentioned in one of the resources from Judge Rodriguez. She had avoided calling them until now, unwilling to admit just how dire her situation had become. But now, there was no other choice. She had to ask for help. To her surprise, the response was more than she could have hoped for. The representative on the phone listened patiently as Elena explained her situation. When Elena finished, the woman spoke with genuine compassion. It sounds like you're doing everything you can to take care of your family. Let us help you with this one-time rent assistance. You've shown that you're responsible, and we're here to support you." Tears welled up in Alina's eyes as she listened to the woman's words. She had finally reached out for help, and it had been met with kindness, not judgment. It felt like a lifeline, like the universe was finally offering her a break. By the time Alina hung up, she had secured enough assistance to cover her rent for the next month. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a temporary one that gave her the breathing room she so desperately needed. For the first time in weeks, she felt the crushing weight lift off her shoulders, just enough to keep her moving forward. She didn't waste time. After the call, Alina quickly grabbed her things, kissed Diego on the forehead, and rushed to her exam. The panic and anxiety of the morning still lingered, but as she sat down at her desk in the classroom, Alina reminded herself that she had overcome bigger challenges. She could handle this. She could handle anything. The test was tough, but Alina didn't back down. She answered each question to the best of her ability, leaning into the knowledge she had been building over the past months. When the test was over, Alina packed up her things and left the classroom, feeling a small sense of pride. She hadn't let the financial crisis distract her. She hadn't let it break her. As Alina walked to the bus stop, she thought about the future. It was still uncertain, still filled with obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a way forward. With the financial assistance, her exam behind her, and her continued commitment to her coursework, Alina felt as though she had reached a turning point. The road was still difficult, but she was no longer alone on it. She had a network of people, strangers and friends alike, who were ready to help her when she needed it most. Alina smiled as she thought about Diego, waiting for her at home. She had promised him that everything would be okay, and for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. The future might still hold challenges, but Alina knew she had the strength, the support, and the determination to face them head-on. And with Diego by her side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The unseen strength. As the weeks turned into months, Alina began to notice a shift, not only in her circumstances, but in herself. She had always prided herself on being resilient, on being able to handle whatever life threw at her. But something different was emerging now. She had stopped just surviving. She was learning to thrive, even in the midst of her struggles. The financial assistance she had received had given her breathing room, but it didn't solve all of their problems. There were still days when money was tight, when Alina had to choose between paying for groceries and paying for a bus pass to get to work. But the difference now was that she felt empowered. She no longer felt like a victim of her circumstances. She had taken control, at least in the small ways that she could. The promise she had made to Diego, to provide him with a better life, had ignited a fire in her, one that pushed her to keep going even when she wanted to quit. But there were still days when the exhaustion would overwhelm her. Some nights, after a full shift, Alina would lie awake, unable to fall asleep because her mind would race, trying to plan for the next day, the next week, the next step. The bills were still there, the rent still needed to be paid, and the looming reality of her student loans made her anxious about the future. Despite all the progress, Alina couldn't escape the feeling that the next hurdle was always just around the corner. Yet, in the quiet moments, when Diego would curl up beside her on the couch after a long day, or when he would bring her a drawing he'd made at school, proudly showing it off with a bright smile, Alina found something that she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. These small moments, these little joys, reminded her why she had pushed through it all in the first place. Diego was thriving too. It was clear in his schoolwork, in his little triumphs. He had grown so much over the past few months, not just in terms of academic success, but in how he viewed the world. He had always been an observant child, but now he was beginning to understand the complexities of life, the struggles that came with being a single mother, and the sacrifices Alina made every day. Yet, through it all, Diego remained hopeful. He believed that things would get better, that there was always a way forward. One evening, as Elena was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to catch up on her coursework, Diego walked into the room, holding something in his hands. His face was lit up with excitement. "Mom, look," he exclaimed, holding out a certificate. "I won a prize for being the most improved student in my class." Elena's heart swelled with pride as she took the certificate from his hands. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of his hard work, his perseverance. For a moment, she was reminded of the days when she had felt so lost, so uncertain about whether she could provide for him, whether she could give him the future he deserved. But here he was, achieving things that Elena had once thought impossible for them both. "I'm so proud of you, Diego," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard for this." Diego beamed up at her. "I did it for you, Mommy. I know you work hard too. And I want to make you proud." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes. She hadn't realized how much her son understood. She had always tried to shield him from the struggles of their life, but in his own way, Diego had seen everything. The sacrifices, the late nights, the constant hustle, and he had used it as motivation to work harder, to be better. Elena couldn't help but marvel at how strong and resilient he was at such a young age. In that moment, she realized something that she hadn't fully understood until now. The journey she had been on, the hardships she had faced, hadn't been just for her. They had been for Diego too. He was learning from her. He was watching her every move, not just in the moments of success, but also in the moments when she stumbled. And he was learning the most important lesson of all: that no matter how difficult life got, no matter how many times you fell, you could always pick yourself back up. Elena kissed his forehead, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "You already make me proud, Diego, every single day." With the school year coming to a close, Elena felt the pressure of her finals mounting. The fear of failure lingered in the back of her mind, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it once was. She had made it through so much already. She had learned to keep moving forward, to trust that with hard work and perseverance, the pieces would eventually fall into place. The end of the semester would bring another challenge, but it would also bring another opportunity. She was on the verge of something greater, something she had worked so hard for, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something larger that she was reaching for, something that would truly change the course of her life. She had been so focused on the day-to-day survival that she hadn't allowed herself to dream bigger, to think beyond the immediate struggles. But now, as she sat with Diego and reflected on all that had changed in the past year, Elena realized that she had been building more than just a stable life. She had been building a future that wasn't defined by limitations, but by possibilities. In the coming weeks, Elena threw herself into studying for her finals with a renewed sense of purpose. She had reached out to her professors for help, attending office hours when she could, and reviewing her notes during every spare moment. It wasn't easy, but she was determined to finish strong. She owed it to herself, and she owed it to Diego. On the day of her final exam, Elena felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. She had studied for weeks, pushed through her exhaustion, and given everything she had to this moment. As she sat down at her desk and opened the exam, she felt the weight of everything she had worked for. It wasn't just a test of her knowledge. It was a test of her resilience, her determination, her ability to overcome every obstacle that had stood in her way. The exam wasn't easy, but Elena found herself answering the questions with confidence. She had worked for this. She had earned the right to be here. And when she finally handed in her exam and walked out of the classroom, she knew that no matter the result, she had given it her all. The weeks that followed were filled with anticipation. Elena continued to work her jobs, pushing through the long hours, but now there was a sense of peace that had settled within her. She knew that the results of the exam would come, but they didn't define her. What mattered was how far she had come, how much she had accomplished despite the odds stacked against her. Finally, the day came when Alina received the email with her final grades. Her heart pounded as she opened the message. As she scrolled down, her eyes landed on her grade. Alina couldn't believe it. She had done it. She had passed with flying colors. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the screen, her heart bursting with pride. She had done it. Against all odds, she had succeeded. And it wasn't just her success. It was their success, hers and Diego's. Everything they had been through, all the sacrifices, all the struggles, it had led to this moment. Later that evening, as Alina sat at the kitchen table with Diego, she showed him her grade. "Look, Mio," she said, her voice trembling. "We did it. I passed." Diego's eyes lit up with excitement. "I knew you could do it, Monty," he cheered, jumping up to hug her. Alina hugged him back, holding him tightly as she whispered, "We did it together, Diego. I couldn't have done it without you." And in that moment, Alina knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would still have challenges, but she had proven to herself, and to Diego, that they were capable of overcoming anything. Together, they could face whatever the future held. And with that knowledge, Alina felt a sense of peace and certainty that she hadn't known before. They were unstoppable.